All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is Wednesday, April 8th, and we are going to start a new unit today. That new unit is on World War II. Before we can get started talking about World War II and the fighting and all of the things that go along with World War II, we need to examine these images, which are of Europe at the conclusion of World War I. It's important to set the context for the causes of World War II, and to do that, we have to go back to World War I. So I want you guys to look at these pictures and first describe what you're looking at, what you see. You'll notice there are people in each image. I want you to describe how you think that they felt. And then people around Europe or around the world, when they saw these sorts of images at the conclusion of World War I, how do you think they felt when people who were not in these pictures saw the pictures themselves? Take a minute to do that. In your note page, you guys have the same pictures here. You're going to write your descriptions here. And we'll come back here in a minute. All right, we are back here. And I just wanted to, before we move on and talk about the pictures or anything else, I wanted to talk about office hours. Office hours are a time of day, every single day, where I am available to go over anything that you guys want to go over. It's basically extra help for remote learning. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I will be available here on the computer for you guys between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. through Google Meets, and then Tuesdays and Thursdays from 7 p.m. until 8 p.m. There will always be links posted for the sessions in Classroom. I put the codes up for Google Meets, so you guys can use those to access the meetings. And any questions or concerns you have there, we can answer them and go over whatever you want. All right, on to the images. So what you guys saw in these images, in both images, they're very similar. There's lots of destruction. Buildings destroyed. The natural landscapes were destroyed. These are pictures from France and Belgium at the conclusion of World War I. You guys may have said that the people in the pictures look sad or disillusioned or despondent. They might be depressed. They might be grateful that the war was over. They might be hopeful that another war wasn't going to happen. And that's an important thing for us to know and remember at the end of World War I. In 1919, in 1920, in 1918, as World War I ended, people around the world were affected by the fighting in ways that they had never imagined they would be. People experienced, there was the physical destruction of the war, obviously, but then also just the mental trauma of participating in World War I. These are some images that the German painter and artist Otto Dix created that about his experience in fighting in World War I. You can see they're pretty horrific. They're nightmarish. The German artist Kathy Kollwitz drew sketches and charcoal drawings to show the suffering that she and her family and the people around her felt as a result of the fighting in World War I. And the big thing we have to know is that at the end of World War I, in 1918, in 1919, in 1920, nobody around the world wanted to be involved in another conflict like World War I again. Industrialized countries fighting with modern, new technology led to terrible conditions for everyone. Of course, this unit's about World War II. World War II is the second major global conflict in which countries on every settled continent fought against each other. In World War II, the fighting broke down into two sides, the Allied powers versus the Axis powers. The fighting started in 1931 in Asia when Japan invaded the northern region of China. In 1935, Italy invaded Africa to start the fighting on that continent. Typically, your textbook, Wikipedia, they say that World War II started in 1939, and that is when Germany, Nazi Germany, invaded Poland. And by just about any measure, World War II was the worst conflict in human history. At least 70 million people were killed. There was one definite genocide, undeniable genocide that occurred in Europe, in Central Europe, and in Eastern Europe that you guys know of as the Holocaust. There's almost certainly another genocide that happened in Asia at the same time. It's the only war where nuclear weapons were used, thankfully. And throughout World War II, the defining weapon in the fighting was the use of airplanes, which between World War I and World War II became really, really fast. They could fly at high altitudes and they could carry large loads. And that was incredibly terrible for the fighting in World War II because airplanes dropped bombs, tons and tons of bombs on civilian centers and cities. Probably the most famous or infamous photograph of the aftermath of World War II is the one you see over here on the right-hand side. This is the German city of Dresden. This is a city where people were living, and you can see civilians were living, and you can see just how annihilated the city was. And airplanes being used in the way that they were during World War II changed war forever, because now typically the fighting involved soldiers fighting each other from two armies involved in the two sides. But because airplanes became so advanced between World War I and World War II, and they could drop huge payloads of bombs onto faraway places, it meant that civilian populations were now targets during war. So the big question that we have to answer early on, before we can talk about the war at all, is why? If at the end of World War I, no one wanted to fight any sort of conflict ever again, why, about 10 years later, did World War II start? Well, the answer is mostly linked to the rise of 4 terrible dictators in Europe and Japan. Those 4 leaders were Benito Mussolini in Italy, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, the military, and then later on Hideki Tojo in Japan, and then someone who you almost certainly all know, Adolf Hitler in Germany. This is Mussolini. He was the first fascist totalitarian dictator to come to power. Joseph Stalin gained power throughout the 1920s. The Japanese military gained power in Japan in the early 1930s, and then Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party gained power in Germany in the early 1930s as well. And our focus today is going to be on how did Mussolini, Stalin, and the military gain power in their respective countries. Before we do that, some key vocabulary words. The 3 words we're going to go over: totalitarian government, dictator, and fascism. You may already know the word dictator already. A dictator is a ruler with total control of a country. Usually dictators gain power with force. A totalitarian government is a government that has total control of the country. They control everything. The economy, the media, schools, everything controlled by the government. And then a lot of these dictatorships, totalitarian dictatorships that rose to power in the 1930s, are also called fascist. Fascism is a type of government that stresses nationalism, or the country's greatness, instead of human rights or individual rights. Oftentimes fascist governments discriminates against minorities, and they deny natural rights, especially to labor and workers. All 4 of these governments, the Italian government, Italy under Benito Mussolini, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, Japan under the military and later Hideki Tojo, and Germany under Adolf Hitler, are all going to be characterized as totalitarian, fascist dictatorships. They were governments that had total control over everything. They were led by those 1 or 2 people, and one person in the case of the Soviet Union, Italy, and Germany, and then in Japan it was the military leaders, and then later one person, Hideki Tojo. They were all fascist, which meant that the countries stressed national well-being over the rights of individual people in those countries. Generally speaking, these are terrible governments to live under. But in each case, these leaders gained power because of popular support. The people in each country supported their rise to power. Today we're going to figure out how. How did that happen in Italy, in the Soviet Union, and Japan? So you guys will notice in your note page, there are a couple down here. You guys have filled in your key vocab words. We are going to be describing how Italy, the Soviet Union, and Japan had these new governments come to power. We already know the types of governments that came to power. Just described that to you a moment ago. And what you're going to be doing is opening up each of these readings, and you're going to take at least the next week to do this. Open up each reading, read the reading, which are broken down into different sections for you. You know, the historical context for the person's rise to power, the actual rise, and then what it was like to live in that country under the ruler. And what you're going to do is then describe how Mussolini rose to power in Italy and what life was like under that ruler. And you'll do the same thing for the other two countries as well. What I'm going to be doing, again, we'll have office hours today on Wednesday. We won't have office hours Thursday or Friday of this week in observance of the religious holidays that many people are going to be celebrating. But on Friday, what I will do is post a guided reading of the Mussolini reading, where I read it out loud and maybe highlight some more where the questions will be. And I'll do the same thing for the USSR and Japan, maybe later this week or early next week. And that's what we're going to be, what you will be working on from today, Wednesday, April 8th, until next Wednesday, April 15th. All right. That's everything for now. I hope to see you guys at office hours. Have a great night.